Hi there, guys. My name is Siobhan Fallon. Welcome back to part 2 of Whipple, the warrior who killed Custer. You guys had a lot of spirited things to say in the comment section of part 1 about whether it was possible for anyone to know who may have killed George Armstrong Custer, or what you thought about the possibility of it being Chief Joseph Whipple who did the deed, as well as some interesting suggestions of who you thought really killed Custer on June 25th, 1876. Your comments were a lot of fun, guys. Thank you to everyone who joined the conversation there. Today, we're going to take a closer look at Whipple's story of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, because there are quite a few discrepancies between what Whipple actually said and what was later printed after Whipple's death. Did Whipple even claim to kill Custer? Or did an over-enthusiastic writer push a story that even Whipple himself did not accept as truth? All right, guys, thanks for joining me. Let's learn more. In part 1, we covered Whipple's biography, and if you haven't seen that yet, guys, check it out when you have a little time. Known as Whipple or Joseph Whipple on the agency rolls, sometimes Lazy Whipple, he was a Minneconjou Sioux born in 1849 in the Black Hills. Whipple was a nephew of the Hunkpapa chief Sitting Bull. Whipple had been a daring warrior from the age of 16 onward, participating in some of the most famous fights between the Lakota and U.S. soldiers, including the Fetterman Massacre, the Wagon Box Fight, the Battle of the Rosebud, and, of course, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Whipple surrendered to U.S. forces in the fall of 1876, and he became an Indian policeman on the Cheyenne River Reservation. He lived there with his family for decades. Then, in 1926, Walter Campbell, an Army veteran, English professor, and Western writer who wrote under the name of Stanley Vestal, grew curious about Whipple when he learned that Whipple had been chosen to lead the Cheyenne and Sioux warriors across the battlefield at the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. A few years later, Stanley Vestal began writing a biography on Chief Sitting Bull. It was only natural he'd want to interview Whipple and his younger brother, One Bull, Sitting Bull's nephews, who had been by Sitting Bull's side during so many key moments in his life. In 1928 and 29, at the Standing Rock Reservation, Vestal interviewed One Bull. Then, in 1930, Whipple, who had participated in 17 fights with his famous uncle, invited Vestal to his home in the community of Cherry Creek on the Cheyenne River Reservation. When Stanley Vestal conducted interviews with Indian warriors, he let them choose their own translators. And don't forget, guys, there were almost always translators, so there's that extra element through which the warrior's story was often filtered. This is something to think about when we read so many of the interviews we have today from Native American sources. Vestal would also bring along a stenographer or secretary who created transcripts of these interviews verbatim, or at least as closely as possible. On the day before an interview, Vestal would tell his subjects the topics he wanted them to discuss, and during the interview, he tried not to interrupt their storytelling with too many questions. He did this because he thought, the white man's sense of values is quite different from that of the Indian, and it is much wiser to let the old man tell the story in his own way, and thus get the Indian emphasis where it belongs. Vestal visited Whipple in the summer of 1930 with his nephew, Dallas McCoy, who served as the stenographer, and Whipple chose the interpreter, Sam Eagle Chasing. Whipple was 81 years old during those first interviews. He was almost deaf and had to use a long ear trumpet to hear the questions that were asked of him. That didn't stop him in any way. The interviews lasted for as long as 9 hours. Along with Stanley Vestal, Dallas McCoy, and the interpreter, Whipple invited men of Cherry Creek to join in the gathering in his cabin. These men sat cross-legged on the floor and they listened, serving as witnesses who could validate White Bull's retelling. White Bull said to Vestal, "I will tell you the truth. I am not afraid. The man who lies is a weakling." Vestal was delighted with the material White Bull was giving him, and he wrote home to his wife, "I have sat on the floor of White Bull's cabin so much my buttocks are sore, but he is giving me stuff worth any amount, and I can't tear myself away. The old man is fond of me, loves to talk, and is anxious to have me stay on indefinitely. How he can tell a story, what pantomime, what mimicry of voice and expression." Vestal finished his book on Sitting Bull, but he was not done with White Bull. He was so impressed with the chief, he decided to write a full-scale biography of White Bull that would tell White Bull's life as well as illustrate Lakota warfare and traditions. So in 1932, Vestal once more returned to the Cheyenne River Agency, and this time he stayed 3 weeks. He brought along a new secretary to record as closely as possible a verbatim transcript of these interviews. White Bull meanwhile chose his adopted son, the Oglala John Littlecloud, as his interpreter. These interviews covered White Bull's entire life. Once more, Vestal was inspired by White Bull's extraordinary own book, his pictorial autobiography, or his war book, Ledger Art. Back in 1879, a few years after White Bull had surrendered and had lived on the agency, White Bull learned to write the Lakota language from Christian missionaries. And at some point, he also drew out the key moments of his life, and he captioned these in Lakota. These drawings mostly recounted episodes of being a warrior, because the Lakota way at this time was that a man was judged by the brave deeds of his youth, and this is what earned him respect among his people. White Bull had documented more than 30 battles and hunts that he had participated in, starting with his first coup at the age of 16 in 1865. Vestal paid White Bull $70, which is about $1,600 today, to make him a copy of his ledger book. And guys, once more, check out my first video on White Bull because I discuss a lot of his ledger art and episodes from his different battles there. White Bull's ledger book is part of a long tradition of Plains pictorial art. The earliest surviving examples are found at rock art sites and represented both the spirit world as well as the events of men, and this continued onward to the art painted on hides, buffalo robes, shields, war shirts, etc. In the 1860s and 70s, the Plains Indians began to use materials they acquired through their exposure to white traders, travelers, and soldiers, like paper, pencils, and ink. And one item they especially liked to use were ledger books. Ledger books were used to keep inventories, and often on hand at military posts. Rather than loose paper, the pages were bound together and numbered. And it was a lot easier to write on a piece of paper than on a buffalo hide. And there's something else about the ledger book. If some of these ledger books had been captured in war, then there would have been a spiritual power gained from the enemy, and a warrior inscribing his own brave deeds over the notes and writing of, say, a United States soldier certainly demonstrates another level of mastery and total victory of the warrior over his foe. The term ledger art eventually became the way to describe this sort of biographical art, even when the art was done on canvas or something other than ledger paper. This warrior art was pretty popular, surprisingly popular with United States soldiers. But the heyday of genuine ledger art was rather brief, only about 70 years. So Chief Whitebull, who was commissioned to produce his art in the 1930s, when he was in his 80s, he was one of the last of his generation who had lived a true warrior's life before the time of Indian reservations. So he was therefore among the last of the Lakota warriors to produce ledger art. Stanley Vestal wasn't the only one who was thrilled with their friendship, as well as the interview process and the books that would come of it. When Stanley Vestal said goodbye to Whitebull in 1932, Whitebull said to him, "Now you have taken down the story of my life. You will make it into a book, my friend. At the Custer battlefield, I was honored for one day, but when our book is published, my name will be remembered, and my story read so long as men can read it. You have done this, and I think you have made this the happiest day of my life." Whitebull also wrote his own introduction to Vestal's book. It was printed in both Lakota and English, and I'm going to read the English translation. It's beautiful. Translation: Moon of ripe plums, Cherry Creek. My friends, my friend, his name is everywhere, Stanley Vestal, has questioned me. All that I told him is straight and true. I have acted as I was taught by my own father Makes Room and my uncle Sitting Bull. My father was a great chief and my uncle a great leader of warriors. They too wished me to carry their great name through life. I wish the same. My father and uncle died long ago, but I am still keeping what they taught me. There are many Indian tribes on this island, the United States, and also the grandfather's people, citizens of the United States, saw me. You all know my name. Everything on this island belongs to the grandfather, the president, so we all must love one another. That is why everything I say here is straight and true, and for the reason that I am chief. I wish I could shake hands with all who see this, for I am still alive. Chief Joseph Whitebull. Okay, guys, this was a pretty long intro. I know you're probably watching this because you want to know about Whitebull's role at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So, we know that Stanley Vestal conducted 2 separate interviews with Whitebull, which were authenticated by other warrior witnesses and supposedly transcribed verbatim by someone Vestal brought along for exactly that purpose, right? And we know from the quotes I shared that Whitebull himself placed a great emphasis on his own honesty. As we mentioned earlier, Stanley Vestal published Sitting Bull, Champion of the Sioux in 1932, and then he published Warpath, the true story of the Fighting Sioux, told in a biography of Chief Whitebull in 1934. In Warpath, Stanley Vestal's biography of Whitebull, Whitebull counts coup 7 times during the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which are 7 incidents of him striking the body of a U.S. soldier, sometimes with his quirt, and sometimes he outright kills a soldier. And there's one particular soldier with whom Whitebull had the most intense encounter. Here's a quote. A tall, well-built soldier on foot tried to bluff Whitebull, aiming his carbine at him, but when Whitebull rushed the man, he threw his gun at him without shooting. They caught hold of each other and wrestled together. The soldier was brave and strong. Whitebull lashed the soldier across the face with his quirt. The soldier was desperate. He struck Whitebull with his fists on the jaw and shoulders, seized him by his long hair with both hands, drew his face close, and tried to bite his nose off. Whitebull yelled for help. He thought this soldier would kill him. Vestal continues, saying that Whitebull's friends came to help him, and finally Whitebull managed to get free. He then struck the soldier several times in the head with his pistol, knocked him over, and took the soldier's gun. His friends struck the soldier afterwards. When the battle was completely over and all the U.S. soldiers were dead, and after the Indians had some lunch, Whipple met one of his relatives, Bad Soup or Bad Juice, on the hilltop. This relative had been around for Abraham Lincoln and knew Longhair, and Longhair is the Lakota name for General Custer. So Bad Soup knew General Custer by sight, and he pointed out a body, and he said, quote, "Longhair thought he was the greatest man in the world. Now he lies there." So that's what Vestal published. But in the transcript, guys, and remember the transcript was supposed to be verbatim, Whipple actually says, "This man had no mustache." However, in the printed version, Vestal oddly chose not to mention the lack of a mustache on that body. At the end of Vestal's biography on Whipple, he talks of the role Whipple played in the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, how Whipple was the most highly honored Indian chosen to represent the warrior nations who fought. He led in the mounted Lakota and Cheyenne survivors, and he was the eminent Lakota chosen to shake hands and exchange gifts with retired General Edward Godfrey of the 7th Cavalry during the peace ceremony. Afterwards, Whipple was approached by Alson Ostrander, who had been an enlisted man in the 18th Infantry during the Civil War and risen to a major in the National Guard. Ostrander asked Whipple to show him where he and Bad Soup had seen Custer's body. When Whipple complied, Ostrander said, "That is the spot." Then Ostrander concluded that Whipple must have been among those who shot down Custer and the last men with him. He asked Whipple, "Are you the man who killed Custer?" Whipple was not sure, as he had never before seen Custer, and no one could tell him where Custer had been wounded. So he answered, "Maybe." Now, this is followed by an interesting line in Vestal's book, guys. Quote, "Of course, the chief would like to believe himself the slayer of so famous an enemy, but he cannot be sure. Whipple has thought a great deal about this." So if that's the case, why do we think Whipple killed Custer? And why did I even make this video? And a couple of you viewers actually asked me that in the comments of part 1. Well, decades after Stanley Vestal interviewed Whipple, and years after Whipple himself died, Stanley Vestal suddenly changed his and Whipple's story. In 1956, keep in mind, Whipple died in 1947, so that's nearly 10 years earlier, the University of Oklahoma Press wanted to reprint Vestal's Sitting Bull biography. Stanley Vestal was able to revise his original text, and he decided to rewrite the chapter Custer's Last Stand, this time revealing that Whipple had actually killed George Custer. Vestal rewrote the scene that I read to you guys earlier, but this time, rather than just refer to the soldier he wrestled with as, quote, "a tall, well-built soldier," as stated in the transcripts, Vestal added new details in the revision. And you can see this on the right side of the page there in yellow highlighter. So now he wrote, "a tall, well-built soldier with yellow hair and mustache." And here is the earlier printed version, and where Whipple repeatedly hits him in the head. Well, in the new and revised version, in the Sitting Bull book, Vestal suddenly has Whipple hitting the well-built soldier in the head and shooting the soldier. And he adds details, again, not in the transcript, saying Whipple shot him in the head and fired at his heart. You guys might remember that Custer's body was found with a shot to the temple and a shot to the chest. Well, this was not just information his killer would have. It was common knowledge General Godfrey had written one of the most widely read accounts of the Little Bighorn fight in Century Magazine in 1892. And he saw Custer's body and said, quote, he had been shot in the left temple and the left breast. So Stanley Vestal adds information that was not in the transcripts, nor in the original biography on Whipple. But once more, he declines to add something that actually was in the transcript, that this particular body had no mustache. And George Custer wore a mustache pretty much since he was old enough to grow one, except for a short period in the spring of 1864. But then comes the explosive and sensational information when White Bull's cousin Bad Soup points out the body that he recognizes as George Custer in the new revision. Vestal writes that White Bull said, well, if that is Longhair, I am the man who killed him. This revised chapter was also printed as a stand-alone article titled The Man Who Killed Custer, and it was the cover story of the magazine American Heritage, printed in February 1957. And boy, did it create a stir. Vestal claimed he hid White Bull's admission and all of these new details because he was afraid of the hostility of White Bull's white neighbors. Vestal wrote, I feared that if this story were published in my biography of the chief, some hothead might harm the old man. Now it can be told. So maybe Vestal was concerned for White Bull, but there seem to be a few more revisions, guys. In the 1950s, Vestal wrote a letter to a friend saying that when he had first gone to interview White Bull at the agency in 1930, he had to tell the white employees there what he was doing, and that these whites objected to Vestal's project, saying, quote, don't you know White Bull killed Custer? Then Vestal claimed, again in a letter in the 1950s, that the night after his arrival, White Bull invited Vestal to a Lakota dance. Vestal wrote in this letter that a mob of white people stood outside the cabin, booing and whistling because they did not agree with Vestal's project. And it was during this dance that Vestal said he pulled White Bull aside and asked him point blank if he had killed Custer, and that White Bull said he had killed a soldier whom others had identified as, quote, Longhair. Then Vestal said that he later questioned all the other older warriors, who then verified the story. So Vestal claimed that he asked White Bull this kind of explosive question, and that he later also managed to question other witnesses, all in such a way that it was not done in hearing distance of the very man he brought along with him to actually record everything that White Bull said. I'm a writer, guys. I take a lot of notes, and I find it hard to believe that Vestal asked White Bull something so important, and yet he didn't write it down. Then he continues interviewing White Bull, not just that week in 1930, but again 2 years later for 3 whole weeks, and yet he never again questions White Bull about this key incident in American history. Even more problematic is that the transcriber, who was Vestal's own nephew, Dallas McCoy, didn't remember the white employees at the agency saying anything about White Bull killing Custer, and nor did Dallas remember the second night with Vestal meeting White Bull at a Lakota dance, or any sort of interview with White Bull that night. So how about the letters Vestal wrote in the 1930s when this was happening, when he was actually conducting the interviews with White Bull? There are letters to his wife, Vivian, that he wrote in June 1930 while he was at the Cheyenne River Agency. And Vestal excitedly describes White Bull's ledger art, all the details of the 17 battles he had been in with Sitting Bull. And Vestal even talks about the melodramas between White Bull and his many jealous wives. He says that the info about Sitting Bull is the cream of my trip. And yet, he does not mention in any of these private letters to his wife that he learned that White Bull killed Custer. So Vestal also wrote in his letters from the 1950s that White Bull asked him not to print the claim that he had killed Custer, saying of the exchange with his relative Bad Soup, "I don't think my cousin would deceive me, but I never saw Longhair before the battle, so that is hearsay and should not go in your book," White Bull told Vestal. So Vestal said he had to honor the request and therefore wait until White Bull's death to publish the truth. But again, this conversation is also not in any of the transcripts of any of the interviews, or at least has not thus far been found. Well, what about White Bull's ledger art and the scenes from the Battle of the Little Bighorn that some have translated into scenes of White Bull killing George Armstrong Custer? Raymond J. Damale was an anthropologist whose work focuses on the Lakota, and he found the American Indian Studies Research Institute at the Indiana University in Bloomington. Damale wrote the foreword to the 1984 reprint of Warpath, which is Vestal's biography of White Bull. Damale agrees that it is understandable that Vestal may have wanted to protect White Bull by omitting the identity of the, quote, well-built soldier. But why did he wait so long after White Bull's death? Vestal actually wrote the obituary for White Bull, and yet he never mentioned anything about White Bull killing Custer. Damale also takes a look at the 1968 James H. Howard book, The Warrior Who Killed Custer, personal narrative of Chief Joseph White Bull. Now, this book had been informed by Vestal's work, and it includes 8 of White Bull's drawings of his role at the Little Bighorn. Damale looks at each Lakota inscription on the drawings, and he found small variations. What was translated as, quote, Longhair, comma, the soldier, was actually written by White Bull in the original as, quote, Longhair soldier, or, quote, Longhair fight. Damale writes that the Howard biography was under, quote, the mistaken impression that White Bull was the self-proclaimed killer of Custer, identified with the first 4 drawings as a sequence representing White Bull's struggle with and vanquishment of Custer. However, there is nothing to support the interpretation that the chief was attempting in these inscriptions to differentiate between Custer personally and Custer's men. Nor is there any precedent in Lakota warrior art for multiple depictions of a single event. Finally, there is a clear correspondence between White Bull's 7 coups counted during the Custer fight and the 7 drawings that depict the coups. Colonel Rodney Thomas, in his most excellent Rubbing Out Longhair, which I highly recommend, guys, has a spectacular chapter on White Bull. Colonel Thomas supports Damale's findings that the use of, quote, long hair was not literal, but a generalization of the fight or of U.S. soldiers in that fight. Thomas illustrates this in a particular image, and that's captioned with, quote, "This is White Bull. I was 26 years old. His horse was wounded in several places and fell. It was in the fight with Longhair that my horse was shot out from under me. It was a hard fight, my friend. Many brave deeds were performed on that occasion, my friend, warlike deeds of the most difficult sort, friend." But you guys can see, even though White Bull mentions Longhair here, what he really is talking about is the greater fight, and he shows this with 3 soldiers shooting at his horse. So clearly, he's not implying that Custer himself shot White Bull's horse, but he's using the title Longhair to mean the battle with U.S. soldiers in general. There's also a map that Whipple drew during the 1932 interviews. And fortunately, there are well-regarded historians who look at this map and actually know what they're looking at more than I do. Bill Rinney, a New York historian and a friend of mine, is working on a book compiling Native American accounts of the battle. And he too believes Vestal's interpretation of Whipple's account is incorrect. Mr. Rinney believes that the struggle with the, quote, tall, well-built soldier was far from where Custer was found on Last Stand Hill, and that Vestal mistakenly merged two fights depicted in Whipple's drawings. Colonel Thomas agrees that, quote, based on the narratives and the map, Whipple was probably nowhere near the final Custer position. Whipple speaks of being in a ravine and only later going up the hill to where the last soldiers remained and fought. Thomas continues, Whipple's narrative leaves little doubt that the particular fight with a soldier that Campbell turned into Custer's death happened at the foot of Last Stand Hill and probably within the deep ravine itself. Of course, there's a lot I don't know, but from what I found, it seems to me that Whipple himself did not think he definitively killed Custer. And I haven't found any other warrior interviews about the Little Bighorn fight that say Whipple was Custer's killer. So why would an esteemed researcher and author, Stanley Vestal, make this claim? Little Bighorn scholar Bill Rinney points out, there's a great temptation to discover a unique facet of the battle. It enhances both the teller of the tale and the writer of the tale. And this is something we should all think about in our own research, especially with a subject as controversial as the Little Bighorn. We need to be aware that writers, and sometimes museums and national parks, might not always be objective in how they present their material. Raymond Damali sums it up this way. Examination of the transcripts of Vestal's interview with Whipple fails to provide any evidence to support the claim that Whipple considered himself Custer's killer. It would appear from Vestal's perspective that identifying the dead chief as the man who had vanquished Custer was more a way of honoring him than of setting the record straight. It's interesting to note that the reprint of Vestal's Sitting Bull book ended up making more money than any of Vestal's other books. The royalties alone totaled $5,000 during the first month of its release, which is roughly $58,000 today. Personally, I keep coming back to the final chapter of Vestal's warpath called Happiest Day, when Whipple recounted that his greatest honor was the role he played at the 50th anniversary of the Little Bighorn fight. And this passage resonates when Major Ostrander asked, "Are you the man who killed Custer?" Whipple was not sure, as he never saw Custer to know him until after the battle, and no one could tell him just where Custer had been wounded. He answered, "Maybe." Of course, the chief would like to believe himself the slayer of so famous an enemy, but he cannot be sure. Whipple has thought a great deal about this. Vestal may have thought his old friend was just as likely a candidate at killing Custer as any other warrior. Maybe he convinced himself it was true, or at least by bestowing this title on a man he so admired, he was giving his friend a final gift, something greater than a cavalry saber, or even greater than writing a book about him. He tried to link Chief Joseph Whipple with the legendary story of Custer's last stand forever. Stanley Vestal, whose legal name was Walter Campbell, died less than a year after his shocking revised Sitting Bull book was released on December 25th, 1957, at the age of 70. He is buried at the Custer National Cemetery at the Little Bighorn Battlefield in Montana. But wait, guys, there's more. On January 24th, 2025, in none other than Las Vegas, Morphy's Auction House held an auction of Western and Native American art relics and memorabilia at the Westgate Casino and Resort. And one of the items that received the most attention was White Bull's ledger art. They auctioned a 162-page historical ledger that consisted of 120 narrative pages with 33 illustrated color pages. The president of Morphy's Auction House said, "What made it especially unique was that it was a personal and original biographical account of battles, coups, combats, and even included a winter population count of the Sioux. White Bull claimed to have killed General Custer, which may or may not have been true. But the book does record what appears to be his fight with Custer, in addition to many of the other battles in which he was personally involved." White Bull's ledger art went for more than $270,000, which was more than twice its high estimate. Nearly 150 years after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, this is pretty big news in the collecting world, and it inspired me to make this video. So whatever Stanley Vestal's motives may have been, he has helped Chief Joseph White Bull remain in the spotlight. And White Bull's warrior deeds, his art, and his story, whether he killed George Armstrong Custer or not, lives on. All right, guys, the next slide has my book lists and links, and please check out the description box for more links and information about Chief Joseph White Bull, Stanley Vestal, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Thank you so much for watching. As always, please like, subscribe, leave me a comment, and if you missed the comments on the last one, go take a look, because like I said, it was really interesting conversations going on there. All right, guys, I'll have another one for you soon. Thanks so much for watching. Okay, bye-bye.
Heart of glass, if it shattered, darker days will come our way. I look back to remember memories that never fade. I know I'm alone. Mistakes that I've made.